Hi, in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to do a Blender array modifier. So here's a partial end goal. So what we won't be covering in these tutorials is all of the rendering options. So all of the lighting and rendering options that are in this video. We'll be covering the modeling, we'll be covering the setup, and then of course the animation. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm in Blender, and this first step is optional, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to add on a bevel modifier to make the edges a little bit nicer. So with my cube selected, I'm going to come over here to my right-hand toolbar over here and click on the modifier panel, which is the little wrench icon. I'll choose Add Modifier and I'll choose Bevel. And you can see the bevel showing up right there. Probably the most important setting is the width, and you can left click and drag in the middle of the width box right here, and you can go ahead and change it to whatever you want. And I think I'm going to settle on 0.04. You'll see my screencast keys showing up here. It looks like in the bottom left-hand corner. There we go. Okay, so that's the bevel modifier. I'm going to click on the little triangle here to collapse that. And now I'm going to go ahead and set up the actual array. Okay, so to do that, you need something called an empty object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift C, and that gets my 3D cursor at the center of my grid. Now I'm going to do Shift A, and I'm going to do Add Empty, and I'm going to choose Plane Axes. Okay, so it got added inside, but you can't see it because the cube is covering it up. If I go ahead and I press the letter Z and I choose wireframe, you'll actually be able to see the empty object inside there. I'm going to go ahead and rename this empty object, and I'm going to do that by coming over here on the right hand side, clicking on the object panel, that's the little orange cube, and I'm going to rename this, it's already called empty, I'm just going to go ahead and call it empty1, and you'll see why in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and scale it up now so that way I can see it through the cube. So I'm going to take the empty and I'm going to press S and scale, and I'll just go ahead and do something like that so that way I can see through it. Now I'll go ahead and go back to solid view, so I'll press Z and I'll go back to solid, so now you can see. Alright, now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add the array modifier and set it up on the cube. So I'm going to go ahead and right mouse click to select the cube, go to the array modifier, add modifier, sorry, go to the modifier panel, go to add modifier, and I'm going to choose array. Okay, so you'll see that the array is occurring here, and I've already got 2 copies showing up here. So over here where it says count, I'm going to go ahead and click inside there, and I'll choose 20. You of course can change the amount. The more you add in, the slower your computer is going to go, so just be mindful of that. Alright, so what I don't want is, right now it's set up for what's called relative offset, and you can see that we've got 3 boxes here. We've got X, Y, and Z offset, and right now we've got a setting of 1.0 happening on the X offset, and that's why you can see that I'm getting a setting of 1 on the X-axis, and it's doing the 20 copies. I'm going to uncheck relative offset, and what I want to do is I want to set it up as what's called an object offset, and then inside this little box below I'm going to click, and I would want to choose empty number 1. If I choose that right now, it's going to get pretty messed up, and you can see that it's kind of getting all wonky and wigging out and all that kind of good stuff. I'm going to go ahead and close that. So what's happening? What's going on? The reason why that happens as soon as I do it is because of the scale of the empty. If I select my empty and I press N as a number, you'll see if I come over here and I look at the scale setting of the empty, you'll see that the empty has been scaled up at 2.616. Okay, and your number is going to probably be different. That's because I just scaled this and just eyeballed it. So Blender sees that the empty is 2.6. Let's just go ahead and make that. Let's just make that 2.6 on all three, so it's a nice even number. Okay, so Blender sees that it's 2.6 on all three axes, and so when the cube and the array modifier gets hooked up to the empty, it then takes on the properties of the empty, and the cube gets scaled up 2.6. So what we need to do is, with the empty selected, we need to press Control A, and we need to apply the scale, and we're going to choose Scale right here. Now, you didn't see anything physically happen, but now you'll see that the scale over here is set to 111, which means, I'm going to press N to close that, it means that the empty now is normal scale, 100% scale, no changes on it. Okay, so now when I go back to the cube and I make sure that object offset is activated and I click on empty 1 as the object, you'll see that no change happens here. Okay, so now would be a good time to save. So I'm going to go ahead and do File, Save. I'll click over here on the left hand side, save it to my desktop, and I'll call this Array Animation 1, maybe? Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so now is the test. If I go ahead and select my empty object, and if I go ahead and now try grab, rotation, scale, it'd probably be a good idea, since we're getting ready to animate, to press N, so that way you can see all of this panel over here on the right hand side, as this will help you. Okay, so if I press G and I grab it, you'll see that I can now control the array clone over here. If I press G and X, I can go ahead and move it on the X-axis. If I press G and X and bring some out, I can now rotate them and do some pretty cool stuff. Okay, I'm going to reset my empty so that way it goes back to normal. So this is where this right hand panel is going to become quite helpful. So with the empty selected, you'll see up here, you can see the location, rotation, and scale of my selected object. So if I go ahead and I set the location back to 0, 0, and 0, you'll see that it snaps back to the center here, and everything's okay. So this numeric panel over here on the right hand side is going to be my best friend during this process. Okay, alright, so now what I want to do is I want to duplicate the empty object, and that will then duplicate, I want to duplicate the array modifier as well. So I'll have two empties controlling two different array modifiers. Alright, so here's how we do it. I'm going to make sure I have my empty object selected. You can see over here it says empty 1, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate, and then I'm going to left click to place it right here on top of the first one. Okay, so you didn't really see anything happen over here, but over here in my on my right hand side, up here in the top right hand corner in my outliner window, you'll see that there are now two empties, one called empty 1 and one called empty 1.001. That's our copy. So I'm going to rename that empty 2. So I'm going to come here to the object panel, which is the orange cube, come down here, and I'll go ahead and get rid of that, and I'll call it empty 2. Okay, so these empties in the 3D space are right on top of each other, which is very difficult to select. So what I'm going to do is, from here on out, I'm going to use up here in the top right hand corner, I'm going to use the outliner window, and I can simply just left click on empty 1 or empty 2, and that's now the easiest way to select. Okay, so the last technical setting is I'm going to select my cube, and I'm going to go back to the modifier panel, and I'm going to come down here and I'm going to take the array modifier and I'm going to click on copy, and I'm going to go ahead and collapse the first one, and for the second one I'm going to rename it, and I'm just going to call it array 2, and again these have to have unique names. So there's array and array 2. I'll call this array 1 just to make it clear. So under array 2, the only setting I need to change is I want to change the object offset to empty 2. Okay. Now if you don't see empty 2 in your list, if it's still called empty 1.001, it's because you didn't rename your empty. The effect will still work, but it'll be a little confusing, so it's a good idea to stay organized. Okay, that's pretty much it. You can collapse and basically forget about the array panel for now, as long as you're happy with the count that you have. If you want to change the count from 20 to less or more, you would of course come back here, but I'm going to kind of tuck that away. Okay, so here's my setup now. I'm going to lower my, so here's my outliner window, and I'm just going to lower the window by left clicking and dragging on the line here, so that way I have access to empty 1 and empty 2, and I can go ahead and animate them. I'm going to leave the numeric panel open over here so I have access to the location, rotation, and scale settings of my empty 1 and empty 2. The last thing I'm going to do is to set up for animation is I'm going to split my window horizontally, and that way I can have access to the dope sheet editor. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and on this black line, maybe I'll press N just to make it cleaner. On this black line right here, I'm going to get my mouse pointer, and when I see a double arrow, I'm going to right mouse click. I'm going to choose split area, and that gives me a horizontal split. I'm going to left click right about here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this new window here into a dope sheet editor. And so to do that, I come down here in the bottom left hand corner, click on the little pop-up window, and I'm going to choose dope sheet. I'm not a big fan of the summary bar that's right up here, so I like turning that off by clicking on this button that says summary right down here. And of course you can go ahead and modify the height of your dope sheet editor, so I'm going to make it about right here. Okay, so to make this a little bit easier for you to see, I'll go ahead and add a material to the cube. So I'll select my cube, come over here to the material panel, and because it was my default cube when I first started off the scene, it already has a material. I'm going to rename the material, so I'll select that material text right there, and I'll just call it array cube, something like that. And I'll click on diffuse, and I'll go ahead and choose a color of my choice. There we go. Okay, so now would be a good time to save again, update your save, or do your first save. Okay, so that's it. In the next video, I'll show you some basic keyframe animation, and if I have time, I'll make a third video that shows you how to set up the camera for this animation. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.